It still was a fairly large vacuum tube, and I think probably microphonics were fun, but it served them well in the beginning of the war, but they went on and developed the next type. And this tube is again on the right, and it plugs into the socket on the left, and it's the equivalent of our miniature tube. But it's kind of neat because instead of sitting on top of the socket, it goes into the socket. And the socket is usually embedded within the circuitry of the radio. And you'll see several examples of that on the other cassettes. The little knob on the top is a puller for the tube. It actually screws into the base of the tube, and you screw it on, you pull the tube out, you put a new tube in, you put the puller on the new tube. And again, this is peculiar to German military equipment. They made millions of these tubes. That particular tube is made in a few different configurations. The most common one is an RV 12P2. The German RV is vacuum tube, 12-volt filament, pento, 2,000 micromode transconductance. They use that tube for RF amplifiers, IF amplifiers, audio amplifiers, oscillators. If you look at the big set on the table, every tube in it is that type, no matter what the function. They only had to carry one spare tube. Okay, got more tubes? Here's another German military tube with its socket. This is a power amplifier, and this is actually an RF power amplifier. They didn't use it for 14 other things. Roughly the equivalent of our 807. Again, special socket, special configuration. The tube fits within the socket housing. Okay, what else do you have over there? All right, I jumped to Japanese, and a couple of the tubes that I wanted to take pictures of at the last minute I discovered my camera said, oh yeah, I want click, but I erased that one. So the Japanese started out with the early globe style tube, and some of the Japanese stuff, I'm trying to think whether I have anything. Yeah, we have a couple here with the globe style tube. And then they went to actually the American series. From the late 20s, early 30s, and unfortunately the pictures I took were of Japanese-made tube with American type numbers, 27, 33, whatever. And ultimately, they evolved a little bit. That's a Japanese 807. It's even more, 807 in their own bottle. And finally, there are a few Japanese sets that use the metal octal tubes with American type numbers on them. Now, they had a few of their own tubes with indigenous part numbers, but by and large, the Japanese used American type tubes. And again, you can see, not so much as in the German, but in the Japanese, you can see the evolution. They realized they started out in the war in trouble because the other people could talk and they couldn't. And so the Japanese were continually trying to improve their equipment. And at the end, it's just a total disaster trying to keep track of late Japanese equipment because they would make 20 of something. And then somebody would come and say, that doesn't work right, we need this. So they'd make 15 of something else. And it's just crazy. Incidentally, the Japanese did have radar. They had good radar. They had magnetrons. They had microwave radar. Too little, too late, thankfully for us. And again, the Japanese military industrial structure was weird. Everybody was in deference to somebody else. So if you were developing a radar set and your boss came in and didn't like something about it, you didn't stand up for your design, you just said, okay, and changed it. So again, their radar equipment is a couple of these, some of those, and it just goes on and on and on. Okay, we have another interesting, okay. Here is a 35-watt German transmitting tube. If you've wandered around many flea markets, you've seen these things around. Again, they made them by the bazillion. As a matter of fact, there is a huge flak tower in the zoo in Berlin. I should back up a moment. A flak tower is a tower, obviously, with anti-aircraft guns mounted on the roof, which means these are pretty sturdy structures. I think the one in Berlin was 4 stories high and several hundred feet in diameter. Within that flak tower, they had a vacuum tube factory. As long as the guns weren't going off, they'd make tubes just fine. And probably to this day, if you go out and rummage around in the rubble of that tower, you can find bits and pieces of tubes. And again, the German tube business was an evolving thing. I could fill this whole table up with just various and sundry types of specialized German tubes. And back to the U.S. intelligence people, they brought back thousands of German tubes. Most of them ended up in a warehouse in South Bend, Indiana. A fellow who lived in the area when he was a kid managed to get into the warehouse and pilfer, liberate, salvage. When he left, there were some tubes in his pockets. Fortunately, because the warehouse burned down, and that was the end of that. So yeah, some of the stuff doesn't survive. Okay, what else do we have? Just another picture of the same guy. You can see the odd face.
I think that's it for tubes.
Got a red one in there somewhere? Ah.
Sorry.
This is a tube that the Italians favored. It's actually a standard 1930s vintage European commercial vacuum tube with a little button base that actually snaps into a tube socket, and rather than pins that have metal nubs around the periphery of the base, and the tube just snaps in. Not the most substantial mounting method. If you bounce it hard enough, it'll bounce right out of the socket. Surprisingly, at the end of the table, there's an Italian aircraft receiver which bounces all over the place full of those tubes. Ultimately, the Italians, and I don't have any further pictures of tubes, went to octal tubes. The second set in is an Italian monitoring receiver that uses American octal tubes and acorn tubes. If you read anywhere that, and I read somewhere on the internet that the Americans had the top secret acorn tubes. They manufactured acorn tubes during the war in France, Italy, and Japan. I have Japanese equipment with acorn tubes in. Okay. I need to, I guess we can go to there.
That's what you told me. No?
All right, okay. How do you find out about this stuff? And unfortunately for me, my mother insisted I learn to read. And in 1984, I believe, excuse me for bouncing around the microphone here, there was a series of articles printed in the ham radio magazine, CQ. German World War II Communications Receiver. Technical perfection from a nearby past. And that particular article was about the E-52 Cone, which is the Cadillac of the German receivers. Naturally, I devoured all 4 sections of that article, and my wheels started turning. I thought I'd find some of that. So, had that in the back of my mind. And I was wandering through a gun show, and here sat a German aircraft receiver. So, I didn't buy a gun, but I bought the stupid radio. We could have bought some shelving right then and there. Anyway, Tried to figure out what I had. There was very little available in the English language. Ultimately, you can click the button, if you would please. Wrong way, other way.
I'm sorry. I'm sorry.
This is a compilation of U.S. Army technical manuals printed on how to operate foreign equipment. And here in English were manuals for German equipment. And it was so popular, he printed a subsequent volume, I think. Maybe,
Sorry.
there it is.
Sorry.
Okay. They really aren't much. Basically, they are reprints of the manuals provided to the U.S. military. If you captured one of these German radios, this is where the wires go, this is the required voltage, this is what the nomenclature is on the knobs. So plausibly, we could operate captured German equipment. We have good radios, we really didn't need to do that. Anyway, that was one of the very first English language references available. And it was kind of interesting, so I kind of went on a quest, and this was in the early 90s. I visited the Imperial War Museum, looked at all their stuff, and visited obviously the Signal Corps Museum, looked at all their stuff, went through all their warehouses, went to Aberdeen, went through their museum, looked at all their junk. Went to Germany, to Koblenz, to the German military reference collection, looked at all their radio equipment, and compiled as complete a list as I could of all the nomenclature and all the descriptions of all the radios I'd seen, trying to figure out, what did these people make? Because I found a little bit here, a little bit there, and something else. And subsequently, things took off, especially in Germany, and the Germans started publishing things. And I mentioned before, restoration. This is one of the manuals for the E-52 receiver, restoration. I've got time to dwell on it a little bit. This particular receiver is cool, and I should have grabbed a picture of the whole receiver. The dial scale you see is a rough reference scale. It actually uses an optical projection system with a back screen illumination of numbers, and the true length of the dial scale is something like 18 feet. So that you can dial in a particular frequency within a fraction of a kilohertz. And they also made a motor drive version so you could preset frequencies, and when you change back to a previously set frequency, it would come back right exactly on the money. Marvelous receiver. That's why, and this is one of several manuals that were printed. And the bad news is most of this stuff is in German. And if you're like me, my German's somewhere between incoherent and halting. But you can usually figure out what you need to sort out what they're talking about. And they're pretty interesting. Also, now, finally, almost all the manuals for German equipment are available in a reprint, that's called affordable form. There are several vendors in Germany, they're now on the internet. Any piece of equipment that you have is German, you usually can find a manual for it and order it, and it'll be in German, but it will have frequency ranges, power supplies, schematics, parts list, everything you want to know. And finally, we had some compilations in German of all the different equipment. This particular one is aircraft, and it's onboard radio equipment from radio senders to onboard radar. So that was pretty broad. Let's see what else we have. Okay, I didn't overwhelm you with books. Italian, there are a couple of Italian books, again, written in Italian. But they're out there, and this describes, obviously, radio surplus, and it covers some of the Italian equipment, a little bit of German equipment. And Japanese, there's a little bit available. Surprisingly, one of the funner ones was published in English by the Smithsonian. And there's quite a section on Japanese aircraft radios in that book, and that's an available book. And that's okay. There are, I don't know, sorry. This is a page out of, there's the front page. The Japanese have gotten interested. There is a Japanese handbook on military radio equipment. And there's one of the pages, and again, it's all in Japanese. Happily, it has a picture, so you know what they're talking about. And the numbers are all in English, so you can figure out what the frequency coverages are, what the IF frequency, and get a little bit of information. But Japanese stuff is, by and large, still pretty inscrutable. That's the right word for Japanese. And I mentioned the Japanese radar. There is a book in English on Japanese radar. And fairly concise. It's a good book. As far as compilations, like I say, the German equipment, we're back to German. Most of the good books on German equipment are written in German. This is a compilation of all the radio equipment, obviously for the years given, by model number, listing the tubes they use, and generally the functions of the tubes. This is a pretty scarce book. And finally, there's another, and I have a copy of that here, a book, and you can tell from the picture, that must be something military. There's an Italian military motor scooter. Who said the Italians didn't have fun? Okay. What else do you have over there?
Pictures.
Oh, okay, there are some radios. Just go ahead and start at the bottom if you would, please. These are pictures and make it bigger. We need a full screen effect for this stuff. And this comes kind of back around to a theme. The Germans made radios for all kinds of purposes. This is surprisingly a fairly common German radio. It's a nice little shortwave receiver with microphone and phonograph inputs that run off of a huge variety of AC power, anything from 80 volts to 280, I think, is a switch you can set the input power. This is not really a military receiver. These were carried by propaganda people, would be a polite way to put it, but they were used to present lectures and informational programs to the troops. They never carried fighting messages. It was all propaganda stuff. This is a military receiver.
Was it like a
Morale, actually, the first one, the troops themselves didn't choose the program they were going to listen to, as far as I know. I think that first one was primarily carried around by the propaganda people, and they put on programs with it. And I purposely did not show any of the morale receivers just because they're not military. The troops did have morale receivers. You do find a variety of them, but again, they used civilian tubes, and they were used for entertainment, not fighting. This is a fairly common armor unit, and if you were to open this one up, it looks like it could survive bouncing around in a tank because that's where they were used. This is the most common German receiver. They must have made untold thousands of them. There are two of them here. It's a Tornister Empfänger type bay. Okay, this again is a military set. It's a transceiver. And if I try and remember all the kind of the nomenclature, I'll get it wrong. But this is a mid-war transmitter, receiver, self-contained. They turn up occasionally. It's really hard to find them with all the accessories. They came with a whole stack of antenna masts and doodads, and for some reason those seem to have gotten lost. But there's a receiver that is findable. The covered ham bands, I've seen a couple of them in operation on 3.885. Anyway, here's an earlier military, this is Wehrmacht Army transceiver. Empfänger on the left, sender on the right. In all the German radios, you'll notice they have dials. There are no channel selectors like the Americans used. The Germans didn't have much quartz, so they very rarely used crystals. Very little of their equipment is crystal controlled. Here is a final transceiver. This one is probably around 40 megahertz. It's still AM, backpack, very compact. I have a sample of one similar to that here, which we can look at. But this is how the Germans evolved from a monster to down to, this is a fairly compact unit. It's about this wide. Okay? There's a picture of the big guy at the end of the table. This is obviously not a portable unit. This would be mounted in a truck, in a command post or higher level. And very sensitive. It's super heterodyne, multiple band, but it's for long haul communications. Some of the cipher machines they were talking about next door, their data would be sent over that type of receiver that we just left. This again is a military set. This is actually a naval set, and it's a transceiver, and it's quite compact because it's an emergency set. By and large, if you think the Army stuff was big and heavy, I guess the Navy figured if that boat was going to sink, they wanted to make sure the radios took it clear to the bottom. It's, wow. This is still another transceiver. I think that's a 15WSEB. I'm looking at it right. This one occasionally turns up. It's kind of cute. It's a little red dial scale. When you change bands, it changes from red to yellow to green. So, nice colorful touch. But again, this is a full-blown military receiver. This guy would have been out there in the battlefield talking. This is an early naval set. And if you think it looks like a monster, it is. I have no idea, but I'm sure that thing's close to 200 pounds. And you can see by the call sign on it, it's been resurrected and is functioning. A European ham has that one. Another naval set. This one is a transceiver, and just on the right of the picture, you see a big box. That's a power supply, which is twice as big as the transceiver and weighs untold. Navy stuff is heavy. There's an example of this set here today. This is a Fernschrecker. The letter at the end tells the frequency range. These were used in tanks. They don't have handles or any visible way to carry them about because they slid into a cage or a rack inside the tank, and the rack was mounted on rubber shock mounts so that the radio would survive bouncing around in an armored vehicle. This is not a military receiver. This is a Horsch Empfänger. which means it's a listening receiver. The Germans made a lot of these. And if you think that the current flap about our national security agency listening in to everybody's conversations, the Germans had these receivers, and again, they're a letter after the model number, which designates the frequency range. They covered from 280 kilohertz up to 400 megahertz, and each receiver was a different frequency range. And they would actually have people sitting with racks of these receivers all day long, tuning back and forth through all the bands, listening for some poor little guy in his attic with a Morse key trying to send a message to the Brits. They also mounted these in vehicles, and the picture I saw of one, it was an old time, looked like an old time taxi with a luggage rack up on top, and just barely above the luggage rack was the Yagi antenna. And inside the vehicle was one of these receivers with a rotating apparatus so they could home in on the signal they were listening to. And they would drive through town and they would triangulate, go knock on some poor soul's door and say, hey. This is a very late model backpack transceiver. It looked pretty impressive. That contains, on the back end, a wet cell battery, a vibrator type power pack. Up front, again, no crystals. That dial you see actually it has click stops, but it is a variable capacitor. They're pretty back up. They're a pretty neat receiver, but it was getting toward the end. So the power is a half a watt or so, and usually the receiver is minimal. They're very short range. And most of these sets, because they were not crystal controlled, had a variable tuning device. And actually I have one here with the device plugged in. It had a little Bakelite box that clipped to their web gear in the front. It had the two dials. One was volume, which was handy because you had earphones on for this thing, and it got a little loud, you could turn it down or up. The second was fine tuning. So if the receive frequency drifted off, you could dial in the channel that you were supposed to be tuned to. Okay, this is not military. This is a morale receiver. It is basically a commercial German radio in a military case. It was built for morale purposes. It's as big and bulky as it looks. It's also good for hernia purposes. And there is a picture of the E52. That's the fancy receiver. You can see the semicircular tuning dial and above the little window, and that's the projection frequency readout system. These radios are extremely popular today. There are upwards of 300 of them still in existence. This is not a military receiver. That's a receiver from well, I don't know, I guess you could call it quasi-military. It's actually from a flying boat, and I'll have to get my story straight. In the 30s, the Germans had regular flights from Germany to South America on a huge, I forgot how many engine flying boat. This is a receiver out of a flying boat. So even though it has a military appearing tag on it, it actually is civilian. Although at that point, Luftwaffe had swastika stamped on just about everything. Is there anything else in there? If you really want to get carried away, on the right of the picture, the little lightning flash indicates high voltage. That is a early 40s vintage German aircraft transport this high. Fenced aircraft, it only weighs 30 pounds instead of 300. The left side of the picture is a little heavier. It's naval equipment. It's got that navy color. That is a radar set out of a U-boat. Because U-boats were a little cramped, they didn't always have such huge, monstrous equipment. So it's astounding that the thing survived, but there it is. And just to add confusion to it, this is a picture of a Japanese receiver, and actually that set is here somewhere, if it's that model anyway. And no, it isn't. That's a Chai too. But just typical Japanese construction. And if you look carefully, the screws on the chassis, everything held on the chassis is held with screws. They didn't make enough of them to set up to rivet anything. When you look at some of the Japanese sets, you'll notice it's all put together with screws. It's all pretty low production. Okay. Oh, okay. It's a little confusing. From this perspective, everything looks narrow. And what the heck is that? Those radios are here. The bottom one is a Japanese copy of the HRO. That's the fellow right here, front and center. And it actually uses the same circuit as the National HRO. If you trace it out, which I have, it's very close to the HRO, with one little catch. It can go to a lower frequency, it has a real low frequency coil set. In order to cover low frequencies, they change the IF transformers. They change the IF frequency, so otherwise you'd be trying to receive a frequency at the same frequency as your IF. And if you look at this, when you look, you'll see some cans in there with the number 2. The other set of IF transformers are number 1. And they're actually held in a thumb screw. You can take them out, put in the number 1 set, and go to the low frequency. Other than that, it's pretty much a standard HRO. The one on top is kind of an unknown. This is, again, one of these crazy, not very many out there, Japanese receivers. It is an HRO. The tubes, and I had taken, someone put American tubes in, and I have the Japanese tubes, I just haven't put them in. Instead of using pentode, all the things in the baby are triode pentodes, or 6F7s. Late model Japanese experimental with American tubes, except they're made in Japan. What else you have? Anything fun? Okay, this is the Dorette, and this is the German's answer to the BC-311 American walkie-talkie. And it's not a very good answer. The battery box is on the left, and it stows that way, but normally it clips on your belt. It has a manual transmit receive switch at the bar on top. The little red knob is manual tuning, no crystals. Super regenerative receiver. And the transmitter doubles as receive audio, and it uses a DDD-25, a triple triode Lochtel based tube, which is a real fun animal to come up with. I think the Americans spent more time fooling with these than the Germans did. Apparently when the war ended, they found warehouses full of them. They couldn't get them out to the troops and get set up with them. The radios are common, the battery boxes are rare, and the antennas are scarce. Everybody grabbed a radio and left the rest behind. This is an unusual, maybe it's military, maybe it's not. It's actually a commercial receiver, but the panel on the left-hand side is an adapter for a Hallschreiber device. The Hallschreiber is essentially a teletype style machine. And I could go on for 2 hours about the Hallschreiber. But basically it was used for commercial data transmission, and I really have not researched whether they actually use it militarily. The Hallschreiber actually prints out characters on a strip of paper tape. It has a keyboard, very much like the teletype, but it's a totally different system as far as printing. The military used the Hallschreiber, they call it the Feldfernschreiber. And I can plug my Feldfernschreiber directly into this thing and it will work, but I suspect it really was used for commercial purposes. But got all the knobs and buttons in German reading, so we had to have one of those. Okay, this might look familiar to someone. This little guy is a Philips, was made in Holland, and the Germans weren't proud. If you had it and it would work for them, they took it. It's very similar to the National NC100 as far as the coils with the catacomb sliding business across the bottom, all kinds of cool stuff. It weighs a ton, so the Germans must have loved it. And it uses the snap-in style tube. It's not really well sighted for beating around at sea, but they used them somewhere. So that's what I would do.
Oh, sorry.
This is the companion to the Tony B receiver. This is a German 100-watt transmitter. If someone offers you one of these, try and pick it up before you proceed any further with any transaction. That sucker weighs a ton. Back up.
Back up.
It takes a 1,000 volt power supply. It basically is a great big output tube and a little tiny driver tube. Very inefficient. I suspect you could wipe out TV reception for miles with that puppy. It's one of those things that I hauled home with reluctance. I'm more interested in technical advancement, and that certainly was not an advanced transmitter. But it worked for the Germans, and they had a lot of them. And I think Hams gave up on them. That's why you don't see them too often. I think they all ended up in the junk. Okay, now you can push the button. Okay, this is another early war German transceiver that does turn up from time to time. Definitely Wehrmacht. And you see the neat little tag on the bottom, Die hört mit, which is the enemy is listening. And they were righter than they knew because the enemy was listening. And one of the tie-ins about this thing is we've got all this HRO stuff. The Brits used dozens and dozens of HROs listening to the Germans every day, writing down all their messages, which was then forwarded to Bletchley Park for decoding. So the enemy was in fact listening. Probably not to that particular radio. Okay, here's a picture of the Philips receiver on the inside. Here you can see the red tubes with the snap-in bases. And just to add to the sport, you notice one of the tubes has a big chrome cup on the top. I think that thing weighs about a pound, bouncing around the top of a glass tube. I don't know what they were thinking. And finally, here's another one of these receivers, and this one is different from the first. In spite of being shabby, it's got a little round circle above the black nomenclature plate. That's the German inspector stamp, which said that one was actually, definitely, truly used by the Germans. Even though it's foreign equipment, they inspected it, put their little stamp on it. The one that was pictured previously looked prettier, been repainted. They wiped out the stamp. Not a big deal, but if you see that stamp, and on a lot of the German Army equipment, you will see an inspector stamp, often just in ink, and it will be an eagle swastika over a number. WAA, and then usually a 3-digit number, which is that inspector's number. The Army didn't pay for it unless the inspector said it was okay and put his stamp on it. And, okay, and now we're back to square one. Oh, time? Okay, I better shut up. We won't get to eat. Questions, confusion? Everybody still awake? Yes, sir.
What the Germans, for example, were there a lot of different voltages like those tanks or the
No.
12, 6 volts?
No. Their vehicles were 12 or 24. Their standard line voltage was 220. And that's what they have.
Ships and planes too were 12 or 24.
Yeah, ours were, in World War II, we had primarily 6 volt.
Yeah. For what?
The vehicle, the electrical systems in World War II, US stuff was primarily 6. I guess they had 12 too, but primarily 6. I'm thinking of Jeeps. Yes,
Japanese magnetron, was that copied from one of ours or a British?
the Japanese what?
The magnetron too that the Japanese used?
No. No, that was, yeah, I may be not correct, but as I recall, they stumbled on, they didn't stumble, they developed their own. You know, we all talk about the Yagi antenna, that was developed by the Japanese and used by the Japanese with their radar in World War II. Yeah, it just goes on and on and on and on and on. And that's kind of why I said, you know, try and pick one narrow area and stick with it. I mean, I didn't even start talking about the German missile guidance systems. Luckily for you, I could only fit so much stuff in the food room. My wife wouldn't ride on the roof, so I didn't bring any missile guidance equipment in or any of that stuff. Okay, anything else? Yes, sir. Yes, sir.
Was there an advantage to having the tube below the chassis?
Yes. Mainly, if you think about it, if you have in our circuit, you have an input circuit and an output circuit. If with our wiring, everything kind of comes together at the bottom. Essentially, you put the tube sideways, the grid's on this end, the plate's on this end. So it's a real problem, and that's part of what they did, because they could isolate input and output stages by making the tube have 2 ends.
I comment on your philosophy in German and American says, you're right, the Germans did not have physical control.
Right.
And because of that, that's why you die cast cabinets and stuff like that, to make the set very rigid.
That's true. And again, I just couldn't bring so much stuff that would just overwhelm. The Germans, in their aircraft transmitters, would have a ceramic block with stacks of ceramic capacitors attached, all different temperature coefficients. And they worked this thing out so no matter what altitude and what temperature, it kept the tank circuit right on frequency.
So, do you have an idea of how many German aircraft radios were made during World War II?
A lot.
Well, I mean, like the BC-348, that was our standard aircraft.
Right.
Over 50,000. I don't think the Germans were any of that.
No. They didn't produce that many airplanes, obviously. But because the German bomber radios are a cube about this big, and they're 2 quick disconnects and pull right off the rack, it's something you could grab for a souvenir, and people did. Now, the later sets are bigger, and so they were harder to get out of the airplanes, the fighter planes. So there aren't so many of those around. But the Germans didn't experiment much with aircraft radios. They had a couple of basic models once the war started. Earlier on, they had several series, but once the war started, they locked in a design. So it doesn't drive you crazy trying to get a complete aircraft set, at least as far as transmitter, receiver, and power supply. Mounting racks, they left those in the airplane.
It was the same for radar. German went to war in 39 with their radar. They didn't develop anything new until they realized
Yeah. Yeah, and from then on, and that's the fun thing about World War II technology, is the Brits would do something and the Germans would counteract it, then the Americans would come up with something, and then the Germans, just a continual escalation. It's fascinating. And, with that, I've got to shut up or I'm gonna make everybody mad at me. You're welcome to look at the equipment. If you have any questions, I'll be glad to tell you what little I know.
I had a chance to get it. Yes.
No.
Oh, city line? Right, I have a morale. The German shore. You know, you mentioned the Japanese and the Germans using American style tubes. Well, they were licensed.
Oh, yeah.
By RCA and the other two manufacturers.
Yeah, although the
Before they
Germans,
started the war.
the Germans did not use any American style tube. This is a forerunner of these smaller systems. This uses a
I like their dial scale, their coil scales better now.
German.
Also. Who manufactured?
What we've been doing to keep these back. Actually, they're a radio manufacturer, but that's the way they
I thought you said something.
Read down in the millivolts.
As I said in the start, you can't tell who we're with, tell who we're bullshit with.
I was, there's another session at 1 o'clock, and you guys probably signed up for lunch, didn't you? So,
Well, I think what I'll do, it'll take me. You want to read the report? If you would.
So what do you think?
I'm dazzled. I mean, to see 2 or 3 is great, but this is a whole job of them.
So you're speaking about your stuff later?
yeah,
Oh, that's.
I think I bought it, and there's the HRO and just 4. Yeah.
I can turn this around if you want.
Oh, that'd be great.
See, this is beautiful. This is early
Well, I'd love to, but I gotta get this
1920s.
stuff cleared for the 1 o'clock session.
And the power supply left at home.
Oh, well, I can't do it without the power supply.
Very interesting talk and display here.
There
There you go. Yep.
Well, I guess some of these things.
This is yours. With,
Yes, sure did.
Yeah, this is the A. This is the low pressure.
keep that along. Take that one. This one is yours.
And actually,
This one right here is
give me
yours.
the book to look at
Okay.
for a second.
All right.
Get this one.
What? Something's going on.
Those are civilian too. Never use them. These are actually not used by military. This is
Something's way better. I can't do this because something's. Is it a video?
Uh-huh. You know,
That's neat.
I can review it.
That's pretty neat. Len, something, I closed this up, but something's shaking, so I didn't.
That was spelled rugged.
The other thing you didn't say, the reason you don't want to display them is because they're ugly. Here, fix this.
Those old carbon mics that they had on those radios that, picked up the time. Isn't it?
Yeah, I used to, when I was in the reserves, I had tankers
Yeah.
Forward on the bottom, but I'm so it bounces around.
It's nice to know all these receivers are radioactive.
Yeah, no, I wanted to mention that.
What's that? You don't wanna sleep with them. There you go. They probably don't wanna sleep with me, so that's okay.
Well, everything the Japanese have now is radioactive.
Yeah, well, that's a good story though.
Not always recommend this kind of stuff, but I always do it anyway. I wouldn't recommend it. This unit uses the oddball 7189 outlet tubes, which were great tubes. Think of a 6BQ5 on steroids. So now here's this unit today. These tubes are very expensive. If you put 6BQ5s in here, they won't last very long. So I have here, just to show you real quick, from Jim McShane, a tube dealer in Illinois who has fabulous equipment and a large inventory, an actual match quad of Russian 6P14P EBs, which amazingly is the substitute for the 7189s. This match quad is not even worth as much as a pair of these 7189s. And that's what they look like, basically the same. Jim's a good guy. I highly recommend him for new tubes if you're very concerned about matching. He is very particular on how he matches tubes, and he does a great job. I'll leave the schematic sitting down in front of it so you can go look at it. And now I'll switch to Fisher. An antique radio buddy of mine was at an antique mall. This Fisher gear was sitting on top of that speaker. He called me on the phone and said, "Kirk, I see," and I asked him what they want for it. When he told me the price, I told him, "Are you still standing there? Very close to these items. Please buy these immediately." And so he bought these items. This is the Fisher Kid items. I have an old Lafayette catalog here, from 1964 that shows this piece here is $169. This tuner was also $169. And the walnut cabinets were an option. Also with this unit, I have the complete kit instructions, the owner's manual, and this guy took this amp to a Macintosh amplifier clinic on February the 19th, 1963, and had them test this unit. And this unit put out 29 watts per channel with, as it says, 2.7% distortion, which is pretty good for back in the day. So it's nice he did it. These units, again, are just like I found them. And Fisher did do something that none of these other guys did. They set up because it was a kit, it has a little meter here, so you could individually bias the tubes, or bias the pairs, I should say, which of course on the Scott and the factory-made Fisher stuff, you could not do. So you were stuck. Now staying with Fisher, I bought this at the Shelby Hamfest about 4 years ago from a friend of mine that had an amazing collection of audio gear he was involved with. I think when he sold his initial collection, it brought way over 6 figures. And he kept this as a daily player. This is a completely 100% as-found Fisher 400 receiver. If you're from a tube talk, this uses the 78-68 output tubes. And the walnut case, as always, was optional. This unit's priced in here, I believe this was $295 in this Lafayette catalog. And it's in nice condition. All the little brights are on it. You notice some of the brights are missing on these. Replicas are very easily obtained, so there's no trouble replacing those. I have another one of these at home. It is 2 serial numbers apart from this unit. This unit has all Sylvania miniature tubes, which is one of the suppliers Fisher used, Mark Fisher. The other unit has all Telefunkens and Mullers, and they're 2 numbers apart. So they were just used up the inventory. And now for my last piece, I had this sitting here this morning. This is a late 50s Harvard Electronics Futterman output transformerless amplifier. Mr. Futterman perfected this circuit. This was the first factory version of this item made in very small quantities by an outfit called Harvard Electronics up in Massachusetts. He's using the 6FW5 output tubes, 6 per channel, to get, they claim, 50 watts into a 16 ohm load. More than likely, we're talking 25 watts into a 16 ohm load. And the construction of this was interesting. Some of you people might have seen it earlier. I do have the back off. I'll turn it up right. And there's the very weird construction of this amp, including all the extremely sorry good old paper capacitors that are still in there. I got brave and powered this bad boy. I spent 12 hours bringing it up in the Variac, and it came up and worked, you know, kind of sort of out of balance. When I talked to an expert on these items about it, he asked me if I powered it, and I said yes. He told me I was crazy. He said the power transformer in this would have to be hand custom made if I burned it out. No stock replacement for this weird thing. Mr. Futterman, to save money, used nothing but TV type tubes. All these tubes in here are like 6FS5s, 6EJ7s, 6EA7s, 7734s, tubes you would find in TV sets. I have a little biography about him here. He was a fascinating guy. Later, he moved to much larger output tubes to get a lot more power out of these units. Back in the day, in a magazine article I found in this item, they considered this the ultimate amplifier to pair with a pair of original quad electrostatic speakers, because this amp probably wouldn't fry on, like most amps would back in the day. If you gave a quad electrostatic speaker 50 watts of power, you cooked it. This wouldn't put out that much.
Turk,
Yes, indeed.
did they use those output tubes as cathode followers to match the impedance of the speaker?
With this, I'm not sure of the diagram. I did not bring it with me. This is capacitor loaded. Basically, you are going through the capacitors of the speaker.
Right.
Later, output transformerless tubes power the speakers directly from the tubes.
Right.
No capacitors involved. They still make these kind of things. Y'all know what a 6AS7 is? There's amps being made currently that use 20 per channel and claim to get 200 watts per channel in that application, basically based on Mr. Futterman's studies. And do I have any questions on my part? John Ruskey's going to come up and talk about the gear he bought. So wait to the end, and if we got time and somebody could use it, I could show a DVD of a few more things in my collection, but we'll see if we have time.
Folks, I'm John Runsky, K4JCR. I brought a few pieces from my collection, and following up on the Fisher theme, I brought 2 Fisher units. These are 3 model units. 2 of these are, this one's early 50s, and this one's a little bit later. You can see how Fisher, this is a preamp and tuner unit, and they made just a tuner unit that looked just like this with less knobs in the early 50s, and then they streamlined and flattened the chassis out, and this is pretty much the same thing from the later 50s in the model unit. And I got these both off of eBay probably 10 years ago or so, and you could buy these things for $50, $60. And I've looked at the prices lately, and for some reason, people are excited about mono stuff again. And this probably goes for $250 on eBay now, and this might go for the same or $200. And one of the competition against Fisher was Craftsman. And they made a pretty nice unit where Fisher uses the aluminum chassis. Craftsman wanted to be a little fancy and use a chrome chassis, and I think it's pretty neat. But I don't think, to be honest with you, the quality of this is quite the same as the Fisher. This thing was full of Bumblebee capacitors, and they're out of there now because I was afraid that thing was going to blow up. But these are just a couple items out of my collection that, I don't know, I may put them back on eBay now that they're worth some money. And I brought this because I know Kurt wants to bring a turntable, and this I resurrected parts. We found this under Ted's workbench. Ted Bryant, whose gear is out here when Robert was heading up the cleaning crew, and I helped with the cataloging all this stuff and putting it in boxes. And this was under his workbench, and it was really filthy, and the wires were hanging off it. And we figured we were going to scrap it, and I said, no, let me see if I could work on it. And I brought it home, cleaned it up, hooked all the wires back up, and golly, the thing works. The motor works. And I got the correct arm off of eBay, and I cried at how much I had to pay for it until I kept watching these things, and I felt, oh, maybe I didn't do so bad for $150. I was able to put the whole thing together, and I made this base. And this is just one of the favorite turntables that the radio stations used, and a lot of hi-fi guys back in the day like this. It's all cast aluminum, and it's very smooth. As long as the idler wheel doesn't have any bumps on it, it's great. So I just figured I'd bring it out and show you. Probably you guys are familiar with this. I mean, there were a number of different turntables, Thorns and gosh, I don't know, Garrard and a whole bunch of them. But these were made in America. These were made in New York, and very, very popular in the late 40s and through the early 60s. So that's a few items I brought for you guys to take a look at.
Anybody got any questions for us? We've gone pretty quick, so I may talk about something else here today. Go ahead.
How does the Magnavox equipment from that era compare to this stuff?
The Magnavox stuff compares very favorably to the Shimano Fisher gear that you see here in front of you. Their stuff kind of started to go downhill when the stereo stuff came out, and it just wasn't quite the same. But the early 50s stuff and the late 40s Magnavox stuff that has the modern FM amp is high quality, very high quality stuff. And this is just the tip of the iceberg of this stuff. If you were fortunate enough back in the early 60s to bought you a pair of a Marantz Model 9 stereo amps for roughly $750, today you would see $4,000 to $8,000 for a pair of those amps. If you bought the right Macintosh stuff, which there's some of that in that catalog, all of that's gone up in price, and the market is dramatic for some of that stuff. Some of that stuff is so valuable, it's like some of our radio collectors here. Should it be restored or should it stay original? In the Marantz high-end market, the stuff that's untouched is worth more than the stuff restored. That's really, and that means it's not safe to play. But that's the way that market is for the high-end stuff.
And then, this equipment over here, it has a stereo capability for FM is one channel and AM is the other channel?
Oh, no, I didn't bring anything like that. Yeah, when they were doing that, yeah, I have some Scott tuners at home. They tune AM on one channel and FM on the other, so you can get the early simulcast stuff. Now, these are true, the units I have are true stereo units.
So how long did that simulcast stuff last?
He started, I guess, in the late 50s and went on to the approved stereo. I think that was 62 or 63.
It was about 3 years or so that they came out with those hybrid systems.
I saw a question over here. Yes, sir.
How does the Dynakit preamps and amps fit into that?
Well, I can talk about that too. If somebody can show this, there's a few things on this, and this is just still pictures. And you can see some Dynaco stuff in here, this one in there. We can get with the Dynaco stuff. Dynaco was always known for their transformers, and their transformers are very high quality stuff. If they bring this up, we'll probably skip a screen here, and you can see some Dynaco stuff. I don't have a Fisher 400 preamp. That's in my collection, it's totally restored. You keep skipping past that one. But I'm not much on doing this kind of stuff. I decided to try this right before I left the house.
Next.
Yeah, go to the next one. Dynaco Mark III, they called the Paoli modifications out of a company in Pennsylvania. They added those monstrous extra capacitors to the circuit, and you'll notice on the little circuit board, instead of there being a single tube, which was a 6A-N8 in the original Dynacos, there's now a pair of tubes. That's a later modification, but that circuit board came from Triode Company out of Chicago. I picked these up out of an estate. If I had an internal picture of this gentleman has capacitors that are valued at $100 a piece inside this unit. And it plays great. In the picture, I've got some very valuable Tungsol Type 1 6550s. Go ahead and skip to another picture there. I think it's going to show some more of them. Yeah, that's another picture of the same thing, showing the giant capacitors. Okay, now stop on this one. Here's something that people did later. Now this is from the estate, as the Dynacos were, of the late Harry Gates of Goldsboro, North Carolina. Basically, Harry took a Audio Research dual 75 amplifier, ripped the chassis off of it, stole the transformers and the circuit board, and modified it to what you see here. This would use a pair of 6550s behind the tubes in the front and a single 6550 for voltage regulation. I think there's another picture of the inside of this one. Now, this isn't really vintage. Okay, underneath, you see the circuit board. Go back one. Yeah, you see the circuit board does say on it, although you can't see it, Audio Research. And then he added these items. These are Swedish input transformers at a value of about $500 a set. These gold capacitors are $100 a piece. He, I'm sure, bought them at a ham fest. I know he knew that kind of price point. You switch to the next one. And on the floor in front of the modified Mark IIIs, you see a pair of Dynaco Mark IIIs, stock, totally restored with better capacitors, still using a 5AR4, and they do test out at 50 watts a channel, 50 watts per amp. Now there in the middle was something I wish I owned. That is a buddy of mine's Marantz Model 8 power amp that I was burning in a set of tubes for it, the amp in the middle, and that went to the auction house where I work at. Totally restored, worked perfectly. That brought $2,100. That is a 30 watt per channel amp.
Why didn't you buy it?
Because I did not have $2,100, and the guy that bought it would have kept going. Would have kept going. I'd have the money anyway. Thank you. John, switch to the next one. There's a close-up of it. The cool thing about the Marantz that nobody else had back in the day, there's individual bias adjustments per tube. So you didn't have to have a match pair or a match quad. What I had was a set of Japanese Mullard copies, all with the same construction that I biased individually per channel. That's why those little black caps on top, see those? Those little covers cover the bias adjustments on the amp. It's also missing the cage, and it's not even in mint condition. You can see the little scratches and roughness on it. So imagine what a mint one's worth. Next, there is a next one. I can't remember what's on there. Yeah, that's that one again.
I think we're back to
I think we're done. Anyway, is there any more questions? I didn't want to take anybody else's time here. It's 1:26, so we've gone really fast.
Everybody hear that? That's what you were expected to be able to copy through 500 KC if you're over a ship or land station. Everybody on the same frequency, slightly different tones, different levels of signal, some louder, some softer, and the good operators could pick it all out.
Complete with chirps and key clicks.
That was a day of Iron Men and wooden ships over to radio. My name is John Dilks. Up until last month, I wrote the Vintage Radio column in QST. I have my last column on my webpage at k2tqn.com if you want to read the last column. I decided to retire. It was a long time, and they treated me fairly well for most of the time there, and it was a wonderful opportunity. Now I'm going to ask a favor. I've been loaned a couple of these sound files from a friend on the condition that they not be put out on the internet or distributed. So I'm going to ask everybody here on your honor, please do not record my session. I think it will become available.
Too. And for example, they had no Adcock high frequency direction finding capability. War progressed in Europe, things started happening over here. 500 of the best hands and commercial operators across the country were these. Radio operator, $1,800 a year. It's not too bad. How much is that a month? $1,500 a month?
150.
No. December 7th happens, what happens on December 8th? And monitor basically all radio communications, okay? During World War II. They were chartered with 7x24 monitoring of all of our coast. Actually 20 SX-28s, so if you love SX-28s, you'll love the RID, okay? And for VHF, they use S-27s. And you can see the different speakers and all that. Again, they sit there and tune through the spectrum, okay? And their job to identify all signals, document, share with other people. Sometimes they would engage in DC, of course, was the center to all this, but they had primary stations, approximately 4. It's not a complete list, but I started trying to come up with a full list, but William Culpepper says, oh, there's Powder Springs, Georgia, which is still a direction finding station, and there was another one in there, Allegan, Michigan, and there's some slides in there from that place too. Center, and here's a group of RID agents getting ready to go to South America to work with those governments down there to shut down the transmitters, and that's basically what they did. specialized gear, where they had paper disc recorders, and they would record broadcast, propaganda broadcasts mostly. There was even the Foreign Broadcast Intelligence Service. They're recording on the paper disc, and so that's what that group of the RID did. Of course, it was good to be an RID agent. Here, this was your typical antenna situation at a primary or secondary. and here's another view of RID operators cruising the effort. So you can, again, you can see the, but it's pretty tough, you know. How many people feel like if you were sitting up, this is the one piece that I was aware of slightly as a, before I started reading about the RID, and this idea of high frequency direction finding stations with these double dipoles that are fed in opposite polarity so that they direction finding stations. And you'll notice again the SX28, and in the back there's a sideband slicer. Of the triangulation that they're doing. And this was a true case. This is when they actually had somebody transmitting after the war started inside the German embassy. And apparently we'd said you can't transmit. But anyway, they did. But read down the bottom what it says. It says the first alert was sent by an aperiodic receiver in a mobile unit zeroing in on the actual building. Okay. So it just says the location was narrowed down to the German embassy, but the transmitter was not seized due to FBI concerns. Was the equipment provider of choice for the RID. At that point, they scuttled the ship. But the Americans took, okay, and it shows you the setup here. Pretty nice. It would probably get pretty old riding around with this thing, but hey, you know, getting paid. Better than being in service, I guess. Sniffer. But the name came from a fellow they had that was a liaison, a British liaison. He was actually an astrophysicist. So he decided that this should be called a sniff Turk. And so transcribing that tape, if, you know, so. Also a reference in one of the mobile cars where they pulled up outside of a Ham's house right before Pearl Harbor. So he shouldn't have been transmitting, but he was. And they were watching his signal on what they called, so they had a nickname for this. Here's a better picture of Dr. Wallace. He had a doctorate in chemistry, by the way. So, but there's his SX28 and the one of the early at once. Okay, it's pretty difficult, pretty big task on a receiver. And what it does, it gives you an indication that somebody's documentation. Here. Okay, it says basically most manufacturers are looking at defense contracts. So this is 3309 Layton Avenue, 3-bedroom, 1 bath, 1,100 square feet, full basement. Okay, his car was really W3ZK, and I held in New Bern, North Carolina. Okay, by Al Parker, who lives in, and it came from a fellow who collected eclectic things. So just kind of weird things. He wasn't really a ham. He just had all these oddball things, and Al's had it for about 20 years. So I was looking through all the RID information, and I found a record. They investigated something over 9,000 signals during the war. They shut down 400 unlicensed transmission about your successes until afterwards. But there was actually a short zone 7150 that we're going to move around in frequent lights. What do I need to do?
I saw this on TV.
I did too.
And this is even crazier.
Did you get a good picture of that?
No, I haven't got anything.
That is totally amazing.
I need a copy if he does give me a copy.
Kahn Manufacturing Company.
Yeah.
That's pretty cool.
That's what you said, right?
Well, yeah, I mean, I didn't lie. It's just, this takes it another step. So. Oh, I know.
In the same state.
It's crazy.
Have you heard about the successor to this one, the National Radio?
No, and RBJ?
I didn't get shot back. Oh, yeah, yeah. Oh, hey, watch that. Hey, I caught that. I want you to hold that gun. Yeah, hold that. I'm gonna get a shot of you.
And this one's gonna end up in a different place.
Start on website.